What is going on, Hot Take Nation? It is another episode of the Hot Take of the Day podcast. And today I am very, very fortunate to be joined by the man, the myth, the legend, Chris Wright, who is the, amongst many things, founder of Liberty E&P, founder of Liberty Frac, active in the community, and has a lot to say about energy poverty and energy policy in the United States. So Chris, welcome to the show. I'm so happy that you came and joined us.
David, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So let's start with the news of the last couple weeks, which is that Liberty, your company, the frac services side and the service company side, has taken over Schlumberger's frac business in the United States. Could you talk a little bit about that deal and what it does for Liberty? And I would preface that with saying one of the things that I've always appreciated around Liberty in the Denver community is the commitment to the employees, the commitment to the safety and the environment. And it really seems like culturally it allows you to expand what you've been doing to a much larger fleet. Could you give us some context on that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. I should say we haven't taken it over yet, but we've announced that deal that's in progress, right? The deal probably closes later this year. And David, there's been a dialogue that's gone on for a while, started several months ago. And as you know, we're not A&D, a merger, a company that's acquired by acquisition. We've been very organic. We grow by hiring people and pursuing Liberty the Liberty way. But they had approached us and said, hey, look, Schlumberger is most profitable, most successful oil service company in history. And I think they realized, hey, we do a lot of different things, but if you do too many things, you're not going to be the best at all of them. And I think they decided, hey, frac wasn't an area. They developed a ton of technology in it. They've been in it for a long time, but it was not the sole focus of their business. And so they weren't the best at frac. And they came with this idea about, hey, how about if we combine what we have, our technologies, our assets, our platform, our vertical integration, and if we could put that inside of Liberty and have that special sauce, cultural mojo of Liberty, maybe together we could make a frac business that was really fantastic. And
which makes sense. And I was going to say, like, one of the technology is really one of the things that has led. And yet in terms of patents, when I read a sort of summary of patents and stuff, it seems like Schlumberger has a lot of technology, but every engagement I've had with y'all since you started, the level of technology into frac design and the way you led on that, how do you think about the patents that you'd be bringing in and the combination of the technological superiority, if I can use it that way?
Yeah, the technology was a huge part of it. They've done some great technological things in frac through the years. And look, of course, some of the technology is older and it's fluid systems we don't use so much anymore. But a lot of it is modern, current stuff. Like, they run their blender and hydration unit. So the backside, the low pressure part of a frac spread, all automated, all run electronically. We've had a 2-year effort to develop an electric frac pump. So the high pressure end of the thing, you marry those two things together, I think we'll have a truly differential electric frac fleet in 12 months. And the other thing you were mentioning, David, is our downhole technologies, understanding the reservoir, trying to figure out how you optimize the cost to produce a barrel of oil wherever you are. They've worked in that area a lot. A little bit different way they've done it than us, but our goal is to bring those two tools together and some of the people involved in both of them and just continue to push that forward, grow our competitive advantage we bring to our customers.
So which brings me to the beginning of Liberty, because the first time that I had heard of Liberty, obviously I was working for Enerplus, I was in the Bakken, and y'all, and this was when you were E&P side, and so correct me if I don't have the history totally right, but you'd had a long career in the upstream E&P and were founded or co-founded Liberty with Riverstone with the intent of doing a Bakken deal. And you took what at the time I think a lot of us in the Bakken thought was an older, tired asset that really didn't have potential, and using some views around frac, you really you surprised the entire industry in the Bakken, because at the time it was 300 to 400 pounds per foot, long laterals, obviously widely spaced, and you really reinvented that play. So if I characterize that right, correct me where I didn't, but talk about your career leading up to the founding of Liberty Frac, and then we'll talk about that, because I find that your transition has been remarkable. I don't know of too many people who have done it.
Yeah, well, it's never been planned out too well. It's just been kind of, going way back. I went to college when I was a kid growing up in high school in the 80s. The one thing we knew was we were running out of oil and gas, and, civilization was at risk of not having an energy source. Naive kid, I believed that. So look, I went to college. I specifically went to MIT to work on fusion energy, because how can we lift the rest of the world out of poverty, and how could I have my selfish desires to travel the world and climb mountains without energy? So, obviously that didn't, fusion is getting closer now with high temperature superconductors, but it's not arrived yet. I worked in solar energy, geothermal energy. So getting into oil and gas itself was even sort of just a happenstance. And originally more on the service side, with a company called Pinnacle Technologies I started, 28 years ago.
Right. I had forgot about the Pinnacle, hence all the advanced reservoir characterization and technology. That makes total sense.
So Pinnacle was trying to understand how fractures grow. With our microseismic and tilt frac mapping technologies, the Frac Pro software. And again, in a little bit of a blind squirrel finds nut, myself and a few colleagues were involved with Mitchell Energy in the late 90s with a couple ideas that by some luck turned out to work. So it started, the shale revolution started with these slick water fracs, originally in vertical well refracs. And then as people moved to the oil window of the Barnett, which also didn't work out fabulously, there was a belief then that slick water works for gas, but if you're producing oil, you need a more viscous fluid. So people were using gels in the oil window of the Barnett. And that sort of took on that, in the Bakken, as when you and I first met a long time ago, it was almost all gel fracs and sliding sleeve completions. So we thought less contact area, more chemicals, smaller volumes, but really you need contact area. So yeah, we didn't think the slick water was just a gas thing. We thought slick water was key to producing oil. Anytime you're in super low perm rock, you just want to touch as much rock as possible for as cheap as possible.
It's funny because I always describe to people who are not technical completions, and again, relative to your level of completion sophistication, I am but a 5-year-old. But I always described when I was at Enerplus that there were two theories, and they were almost religious. There was the Billy Odd theory of IPT, which was the big, heavy, single dominant 40-pound frac, viscous fluid, control it, carry the sand, propagate the sand, and that you would have these dominant fracture plays that you could get away with lower simulation. And then there was what I called at the time, not being as familiar with Pinnacle, was the Bob Ree theory of Halliburton, which was, duning and slick water and high rates and frac everywhere. And it always seemed to me that you could never combine the two. Like you were either a believer in the high viscous and then a believer in the slick water, or you were a believer in the sliding sleeves, or when Whiting was one of the pioneers, I know Liberty was as well, moving to plug and perf in the Bakken. It was just this mind shift that massively changed completions. When was it that you saw the opportunity in the Bakken and said, look, I think they're mischaracterizing the asset, and we could take, I think it was Sequel, if I remember correctly, the asset that you bought.
Sequel was Liberty Chapter 2. So Chapter 1 was really 2009. Myself and a friend and a partner of mine, Mark Pearson, were talking to a small player in the Bakken that had some acreage they thought was in a good area. They'd hired a big multinational service company to frack wells for them, but they didn't get very good results. So they wanted our thoughts on that. And our idea then was, wow, low permeability, lots of oil in place. This should be a high rate, high volume slick water. We started actually re-fracking a previously fracked sliding sleeve gel well with slick water. And we did this on 2 wells, and the results were quite exciting. And so that started hey, well, maybe we're going to drill some new wells. How would you design them from the start? So this is 2009. And our thing was, and there wasn't plug and perf or slick water done that we were aware of in the Bakken. So we came out, designed 2 new wells with just a very different approach, and the results were dramatically different. So that set us off on, we got to get some acreage and we got to be an operator in the Bakken.
Okay. I mean, and which is interesting, because that brings us to where ultimately I wanted to talk to on the service side, which again, as the story has been told to me, and I remember working up there from 2009 to 12. In 2009, it was still very early. When I was at Enerplus and we went on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, we always laughed because Marathon was working from the south up, and then there was just this hard line, and then EOG was working from the north down, and there was a hard line, and that hard line was the reservation, and there were 4 or 5 private equity guys, Lynn Peterson at Kodiak, who obviously Jack Vaughn, who was at Peak, but there were very, very few wells that were drilled, but there was, other than boundaries, there was no reason to not go there. By 2012, it was just everyone had bought, WPX had bought, Whiting had bought, Enerplus had bought. But the reason we were using sliding sleeves at Enerplus was we weren't big enough to get the attention of Schlumberger and Halliburton to frac. And so they were like, we would love for you to use our sleeves. At the time, no offense to either of them, we didn't love their sleeves. We loved the Baker ball drop system. So we were fracking with the ball drop simply because we knew with plug and perf, it was so busy, we could not get a frac crew. And in 2017 at One Energy, the reason we used sleeves on our first two wells was because, again, we could not get a frac crew because it was so busy. But you took it a totally different way than I did, and you said, well, that's a bottleneck. I should start a frac company.
That's right. That is right. At that time, so we launched Liberty Resources in the fall of 2010, and it was just as you said, the frac market was so tight that the big guys wouldn't frac your well unless you would use sleeves, not only because they wanted to sell that product, but you could frac a well with sleeves in a day, and at that time, plug and perf took a week. So, hey, they could get more work done with sleeves were definitely better for service companies. But our view was ultimately if operators have better economics, they'll drill more wells, and ultimately that'll be better for service companies. But you're right. In doing some of the stuff we were doing was a little bit trickier than what was standard. So the industry had grown so fast, we finally just realized we should start our own frac company, not just to frac Liberty's wells. I never would have done that. I wasn't a fan of the internal service group. If you're going to go into something, to me, you better go all in. So our idea was, all right, we're going to start a frac company. Pinnacle was a service company, so I love the human cultural side of service companies. So the idea was, all right, I'm going to try to go make the best damn frac company, period. And which was just an idea until I met Jim Brady in a pickup truck. That gave it some teeth.
So eventually you made the decision to leave the E&P side and focus all of your efforts on the service company business. Was that because of your roots, or you just saw potential? And then we'll talk about the culture. But one of the things that you are by reputation known for, and everyone who I've ever known that's worked for you, including a landman that you know and I know very well, just absolutely thinks the world of you, and the honesty with which you deal with people, the culture that you've built at both of your companies, but specifically with the frac side, which obviously tail wagging dog, you have a lot less control on the market. What was it that made you decide, I really want to do the frac side and I'm going to build a company that's differentiated with the culture?
So, yeah. Look, I think ultimately in all companies, E&P companies, midstream companies, service companies, culture is that ultimate asset. Because if you want to do something special, it's really about the people. You've got to have great people want to be there and then work well together. But yeah, service companies are just bigger entities on the human side. And that's where I came from. Pinnacle, I spent much more of my career in than Stroud. So original service company was Pinnacle, original E&P company was Stroud, a Barnett Shale gas producer. But sitting there in 2010, as we were just talking, I think I was itching for getting back into the service company side. I stayed in both. So I stayed as CEO of both companies for a while. The downturn made it so that 50-50 is not enough, and there was much more people in the service company. So I became, CEO and chairman there, and just chairman in the E&P company. But the other thing I liked about the frac company, Liberty's frac company, was you could work for everybody. Liberty Resources, we were all in to make the best out of the 40,000 acres we had. But look, the The Bakken was several million acres.
Mm.
So if you wanted to learn about different areas and interact with different people with different views and different attitudes, just a broader perspective. And I knew in the frac company, we would someday leave the Bakken and be in other areas as well. So I don't know. I would say the excitement of the broader footprint, and also think of that, Dave, in 2010, not too far from the financial crisis. Financial markets were coming back. You and I had ideas and we were doing okay, but blue collar America was really crushed by the financial crisis. And that problem went on for a long time. So that played a role in it as well, for me as well. That look, the people that really built this country that are critically important, they were in a much worse place than you and I were. So the idea to bring technology and culture, but where the majority of the people would be people that work with their hands in the field, blue collar America, that excited me. And that really has been the magic of Liberty. Has been the people in the field. My job is to support the guys in the field. I'm support team. They're actually doing the work.
And you during the pandemic are at a very interesting crossroads because of that exact issue. And when you look at an E&P company, most people support the capital if they're not drilling, but their office staff, their technical staff, they're obviously in the field. But work from home is very different. But with a service company, you have so many people on location. You have not only all the safety that we implement every single day in our pre-job safety meetings and our policies and procedures and our MSAs and everything, but on top of that, you're now dealing with a pandemic, lots of people in close proximity. You're an essential service. How did you, first of all, implement systems? But secondly, how do you balance the work from home, the have to be in the field, how the two organizations interact, and how do you see work from home kind of continue as a long-term thing? One of the things I liked from my conversation with Vicki Hollowbush, she's like, for 9 months this was good, but we're missing the collaboration, we're missing the team, and maybe there isn't like a permanent work from home solution or a permanent work from office, but we're starting to miss things and we need to be back in the office. I'm curious, as a leader of a massive organization, how you've seen all of it.
Yeah, I loved your dialogue with Vicki. And look, in the short term, your team, your office team or engineering team, can you continue remotely? Yeah, I mean, of course you can. Humans are ingenious. But I get driven crazy by hearing the tech companies, oh, we're never going to have an office again. We're more productive at home and we can make more phone calls with less distractions. What's those distractions? Meeting people at the water cooler, walking down the hallways. Those are often the most important interactions you have in your office. Those are the culture. Those are the glue. Those are the spontaneous idea generators. So yeah, I'm not a believer that, we're never going to need offices again at all. On the flip side, I've always been a believer of being flexible. Like I want to climb mountains. I just spent last week in the Grand Canyon. And to have it so that you're not only working when you're office, right? You're working when you're in your office, but when something goes wrong in your well, David, and they call you up, it doesn't matter where you are. You're on the phone, you're working with those people, you're reaching out to others. So I do like the flexibility of Zoom. And I do think workplaces in general have been much less flexible than they should be. Liberty's had this, no vacation policy. Come on, just do your job. We'll treat you like an adult. Of course, you can work more remotely in different places. So I think that's going to spread wider from the pandemic. That may be a good thing that came out of it. But the ultimate work is on location in the field. And that can't be done by Zoom or Works or whatever tool you're using. That work in the field has to happen. And that was a very tough thing, David, in that when the demand for oil collapsed faster and deeper than it ever has, that meant demand for our services, for frac service, just collapsed. And in my career, I've never laid anyone off. To me, you go through downturns by grabbing market share, by holding on to your most important assets, your people. But we saw that for months, there was going to be such a dramatic drop in demand for services that for the first time in my life, I had to cross that bridge and lay off hundreds of people that had their heart and passion in this company. And yeah, the roughest time in my professional life by far.
No, I have seen of late in the most recent Primary Vision frac report, which is the one I kind of stay in touch with, is that we hit a bottom of about 45 frac crews, and as of last week, we were up to 101. So, certainly not the heyday of 350, but it does seem like activity is picking up for Q4 as companies are feeling a little bit more stable about pricing, and I think in particular trying to stem declines. What are you hearing from customers that's different today than you did then in terms of the demand for technology? You highlighted electric frac crews, which really are about emissions, and we have these multi-well pads. How have things evolved, either like accelerating change that you saw coming or veered off to somewhere else on technology relative to the conversations you were having in January and February of this year, say?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that happens in a downturn is when the market is tight or tight-ish, most frac fleets that are staffed are busy. The operators have less, I would say, a little bit less flexibility in who they're going to work with and how that's going to work. Inertia plays its role. Well, we got these guys and they're doing a fine job, so we're going to stick with them. And then when you have a huge disruption and a downturn, everybody can rethink, hey, do we have the right partners there? So the last downturn was really terrible to go through, but it grew market share hugely for Liberty. And I think we're seeing the same thing here. Downturns stress everyone's business, and everyone's got to think, am I doing the best I could be? Do I have the right partners? Are we doing everything we can on the technology front to figure out how to lower our cost to produce a barrel of oil since oil prices have dropped so much? So it sort of shakes up the industry. And one thing I should comment about activity levels. Yes, the frac fleet activity level bottomed sort of in late May, maybe early June. And at a crazy low. But for us, and I've said this publicly before at Liberty, June was better than May. July was better than June. August was better than July. September's been better than August. October for us is going to be better than September. So it sunk really low, really fast, but it's been a continual upward march since then. Industry's still in tough shape right now, but we're going the right direction. And that feels good. The last downturn took 18 months to grind down, and then we came back pretty quick. This one just dropped off a cliff, but we've been grinding up for months now.
I'm going to come back to that point because I think also in the stock market, not to make prognostication, but with the speed of data and technology and information, things seem to really happen faster, and that rate is really accelerating. One of the comments you said earlier, going back to the beginning of your career, was that you had disagreed with the fully integrated model. And I think historically in E&P, we saw Unit Corporation declare bankruptcy. We saw Pioneer sell their frac crews that they had for a long time internal. Exxon and Chevron, as two of the big behemoths, have never internalized. I'm curious if, given the depth and shape and context of this downturn, do you think that there are some companies that may try to do a fully integrated, or do you just see like a service company like yourself taking a larger share of wallet than you may have historically? Again, I'm not saying you're going to get into drilling rigs or not, but just share a wallet so that if you're talking to a customer with your sales force, not only are you putting fracs, but you're using sleeves, you're using the rigs, you're using the porta potties, you're streamlining and consolidating. What do you think will happen in that for the industry over the next 3 to 5 years? Any changes?
I think the integrated model, the trying to do too many things just has rarely been successful. Sometimes you say, well, there's some synergies there, and that's true. But the thing is, if you're going to be really good at something, you better be deeply focused on it. You can't dabble in something and just be okay. And so, no, I think we're seeing most of the people that did try the integrated model are going away from that. I think it's, to run an E&P company, that's a certain set of skills. It's a certain mindset. It's different than to run a service company. And which is why, we talked about Liberty. They've always been very separate companies. Liberty Resources and E&P, Liberty Oilfield Services, a frac company. They're different cultures, different companies. We've never been integrated. They are separate businesses. So yeah, when oil prices get high and capital is free flowing, people try to do different things. But I don't think we'll see a rebound of the integrated model. It really wasn't a success anywhere.
Right.
What's best is for people to deeply focus at their core skills and build competitive advantages in those.
So you talked to the beginning of your career when you were at Pinnacle, which it wasn't the beginning, but 20 years ago, 1999, Mitchell was pushing frac technology. You started doing fracs in vertical wells, slick water, and it kind of expanded. So from a technology standpoint, the shale revolution was enabled by fracture technology and horizontal wells. As you look to the future, what technology do you see? Is there any snippet of this will be a game changer? And I'm going to exclude EOR because obviously EOR has potential and it changes recovery factors, but probably takes a different price environment. Is there something that you see that's going to dramatically shift the cost curve for shale down in the coming 3 to 5 years that you've paid attention to or heard about or anything? Or is it just getting more efficient with our fracs, putting better stimulated reservoir volume, using better sand, better fluids, etc.? What do you think on technology?
Well, I think the things we can see, they're always just the incremental improvements of what we're already doing. We're using more big data analytics to figure out what's the right recipe, in this area. And if the price of sand or chemicals or oil changes a lot, how does that recipe change in response to those commodity prices? So we work on the incremental things, the game-changing things, and they happen. You never see them beforehand. Like when we were doing these large slick water fracs in the Barnett Shale, and hey, that looks exciting. We thought this was an exciting way to produce gas in the Barnett Shale. Nobody had any idea that this would be the game changer it was. So I think the real game changers, I wish you could see those in advance, but I don't think you can, or I certainly never have. So there may be game-changing stuff going on right now, but we don't know what it is. But incrementally, how can we get fracs done faster, cheaper, safer, lower emissions? How can we design frac designs, reservoir specific or whatever? Those are incremental things, and those are obviously very significant. They're lowering the cost to produce a barrel of oil every year. So to me, we work on those incremental things we see right now. We may be in the middle of a game changer one. It may hit us in the head a year or two from now, but I don't have any insight in that right now.
Okay.
I wish I did.
Yeah, me too. It would be a great place to invest. At least it's tangible, unlike Tesla, but that's a different conversation. So you started your career at MIT, and you were very focused on energy, and it's one of the platforms for which I think you're now most famous. And famous is obviously a big word, but you're really well known for your advocacy of energy and energy policy and the impact of energy on the lives of billions of people around the planet. Talk to me about how your thinking has evolved, and as we move to the elections, and this isn't a partisan issue, but concerns that you have from American energy policy and from maybe some things people misunderstand about the energy grid in America.
Yeah, look, energy is this enabler of our lives today. If you look at the history of the world, how humans got energy was probably the defining characteristic of that era. And look, I say we've been 3 very broad energy transitions. The arrival of fire. Now, that's of where a million years ago. We know very little about society before fire and all that. But think of the dramatically different things you could do with fire as far as food you could eat that you couldn't eat otherwise. It allowed to break down complex carbohydrates. It expanded human possibilities enormously. We know so little of human life before fire that we don't know too much about that one. The next big energy transition that was just dramatic was the invention of agriculture. Of course, which was a creeping thing that then spread pretty wildly over the world. Dramatic growth in the human population, the arrival of cities and language and culture, art. Art was there before agriculture, but the arrival of large communities and written language, religion, culture, those arrived with agriculture, a change in the way humans could liberate energy from the natural world.
Well, and I think and on that one, yeah, and you might have been saying it, but a lot of people forget that when you lived in a hut and you didn't have agriculture that was being grown as a specialist, every single person had to do the hunting and the gathering, but society, no one had time to sit and paint and develop language and develop other skills. And as you said, agriculture changed all that. Sorry to cut you off.
Right, and you weren't generally living in a hut. You were nomadic. You were having to follow food sources. So yeah, agriculture meant on this land, we're going to produce vastly more energy than we did before. So you started settled society, exactly, larger population gatherings and all that. So agriculture, this different source of energy, changed the world dramatically. What it didn't do was make the lot in life of the average person meaningfully better. Human life expectancy was still 30, maybe around 30 years before and after the invention of agriculture. A lot of people have argued it actually got worse. Diet got more restrictive, more narrow. We started a hierarchical society. So you had, kings and queens and peasants, and you had, when you were in a band, there's still a tribal leader or an alpha, but you had a more flat society. So society became much more structured, much more divided, much more top down from agriculture. So the third energy transition, the arrival of fossil fuels, is just dramatic. And it's the one that has dramatically changed the lot in life of the common man, doubled human life expectancy globally. We used to have over 90% of the people living on the equivalent of $2 a day. Today it's 9%, which is still way too many people. That's still hundreds of millions of people. But it's the exception now, not the rule as before. So people live longer lives, opportunity has grown. To me, the two things that really created the modern world was the arrival of fossil fuels, just this dramatic increase in available of energy to each human, and the growth in human liberty. Before it was all top-down structures, a more stifled society. The growth of bottom-up societal organization and liberating the freedom of individuals, that's the other major force creating the modern world, which is why our companies are called Liberty. The arrival of fossil fuels, the growth of human liberty. Before then, slavery was in every major society that could. Now it's still, unfortunately, not totally gone, but it is in the shadows, and it is reprehensible to all of us that slavery existed. Women didn't have the right to vote to 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago. So these awesome things we take for granted in the modern world, they were only enabled by this dramatic increase in available human energy and this belief in bottom-up social organization, human liberty, not top-down.
I love the way you contextualize that conversation around energy, because obviously food is energy. We need food to live. And so when you initially mentioned agriculture, I was like, well, that doesn't feel like energy. But of course it is, because without that food, we don't survive, we don't thrive. And then the energy system that allowed us to double our expectation of life allowed us to transport foods larger distance, and obviously the planet has grown. I had Jigger Shaw on the show, and I know you've spent a lot of time researching Germany and California in terms of electric power. And so if we just say our society needs energy to survive, whether that's wind, solar, nuclear, geothermal. I had Mark Mills on the show last week, and he talked about how there's never been an economy or a market-driven solution that has made costs more expensive that has survived. And so we always pick the solution that is the cheapest. I'm curious, as you look at California and the rolling blackouts, and as you look at Germany kind of moving away from some of their solutions, how you see the cost of energy and what's being covered by this levelized cost of energy study that Lazard does that seems to show wind and solar is the most efficient, most economic, doesn't need subsidies, and big bad fossil fuel has subsidies. Where do you fall in all that, and how do you synthesize that information?
Yeah, so the grid is, and I'd love to talk about that levelized cost of energy, because of course that conclusion as wind and solar is cheaper is 100% wrong. And the reason is, I use this babysitter analogy. Imagine people tell me, hey, if I just do the math of how much it costs to build a wind turbine and the life it's going to do and the total money I invested, here's the cost per kilowatt hour of a wind turbine, and that's actually cheaper than over here. Well, imagine this babysitter analogy. You and your wife want to go out to dinner, and so you need a babysitter to arrive at a certain time and leave at a certain time. And now the government comes along and says, well, yeah, but there's a cheaper babysitter. You're paying that one, $10 an hour, but we've got one for $8 an hour. But the only difference is we don't know when this babysitter is going to show up, and we don't know when this babysitter is going to leave. So you still have to have the $10 an hour babysitter showing up at 7. Maybe the other babysitter doesn't show up till 9, and then the original one can't go home because this one arrives at 9, and you don't know when she's going to leave again. So you end up pay for 2 babysitters. Fossil fuels, if you could sell power just whenever you produced it, that would definitely drive your cost down. Fossil fuels now have the opposite. They have to provide electricity, and as soon as something else arrives in the grid, they have to throttle back whatever amount this new energy arrives, and they have to constantly firm that. So that intermittency energy, it just dramatically lower value for it. Then you could go into the subsidies for building the capital and using the grid and all that. But let's leave that for a more technical discussion sometime else.
But that's good. I mean, that's a great point because, I mean, of course, everyone knows the consistency. The wind doesn't always blow. The sun doesn't always shine. And battery technology at this point doesn't allow us to store it. And so you're exactly right. And that in the level, in all of the studies I've ever read and all of the definitions, they've never talked about the consistency of supply. They've simply talked about the cost of a supply in a given period of time. That's an excellent, I've never thought about it that way.
We just spent a week in the Grand Canyon. My wife's sister turned 50, 9 family members spent a week hiking down the South Rim, up the North Rim, back down and around. So two things we wanted for energy, my watch, my Apple Watch, and our phones. We used our phones, no signal down there, just to take photos, right? So I took a brick that weighed several ounces, that a battery that I could recharge things with. I also took a fuel canister, 8 ounces of liquid petroleum gas. 8 ounces was not gone when I came back out the other side 5 days later. Boiled water for breakfast in the morning. Boiled water to cook our meals at night, at dinner. We got a gigantic amount of energy out of an 8 ounce. We brought a second one, never finished the first one. I got probably 1,000 times more energy out of that 8 ounces of fuel than I did out of the battery that weighed half as much. So it's just, and Mark Mills is very good at this. It's about energy density. How much materials, steel, land, cement does it take to produce a certain amount of energy? We want to move to more energy dense sources. But as Germany and California have done, they've gone to less energy dense sources, lower energy density, and higher intermittency. And what's been the result? Germany, I usually talk about 20 years. Let's just zoom into the last 10 years. Germany has spent over $300 billion in the last 10 years for their Energiewende, right? This energy revolution. 300, scale that up to the US economy, that's like close to $2 trillion. And what did they get? They went from 80% of their energy from fossil fuels in 2010 to 79% of their energy from fossil fuels today. They've tripled the electricity price of the United States today, triple and double what they had before they started it, for actually a very, very small change in their total energy sourcing. So when you go to these larger, so people say, well, it's cheaper. Well, then why did that happen? California is the same story. I lived in California for 19 years. They spent an enormous amount of money through mandates and requirements. They now have over 50% higher electricity price than the rest of the United States. For industrial energy, over 80% higher electricity price. And what this means, for the average Californian, in San Francisco, they barely notice it. But for low-income people, it's a big difference. Energy-intensive industries just leave California. So blue-collar jobs leave. California has the highest adjusted poverty rate in the nation. That's U.S. Census Bureau data, not Chris Wright's opinions. Highest, they passed Alabama, they passed Mississippi. They have it's very tough to be a low-income person in California. And that's the same thing in Germany. The United Kingdom, of course, who's gone the same direction. They did a public health analysis. In the United Kingdom, they estimate they kill 26,000 people a year because of the increase in energy prices. Think of low-income elderly people. In the winter, they don't heat their houses as much as they would because energy is so expensive. They didn't cool them as much in the summer. This causes stress on people that are already in poor health, and it ends people's lives. So yeah, just making higher energy prices, there better be a good reason why we're doing it.
So why do you think that and I know a lot of people in oil and gas talk about, I don't understand why our message isn't getting out, and it's not even about oil and gas, it's about the cost of energy. And to use your example, we're trying to pass a $2 trillion stimulus package, depending on whether you're Republican or Democrat and where that comes out, but on top of $6 trillion of stimulus we've already put in, with virtually no debate and no discussion, with the primary answer that anyone gives is, but what about grandma? We have to save grandma from the potential of a virus maybe catching her, and so we need to stimulate and shut down. And yet, there's 26,000 people in the UK that die of energy poverty. You have California has the highest level of poverty of anywhere in the country, and no one is talking about how energy policy is influencing it. And yet our politicians are barreling down a path with whether the Green New Deal or, ban fracture stimulation, which is, 100% of natural gas, 70% of natural gas and 100% of oil in the country that's new is being produced because of fracturing. You ban that, you have no fossil fuels in the States. Why has people not had this intellectually honest discussion on a public stage?
I wish I knew the answer to that. But look, fear is incredibly powerful for people, right? It is this awesome political force. We've seen it in COVID, as you've talked about before, right? If people are fearful, they'll give up some of their freedom. They'll give up some of their power to you because you're going to give them security. That's always been the argument for why we need more top down. I started talking about the modern rule, but it's more bottom up. There's always the force, the big forces of history are to concentrate power at the top. We got wealthy, we got freedom, we got these better lives by growth and freedom, but the people in power always want more power, right? It's just, we want to grow our businesses. If you're in government, your business is government. So it inherently wants to grow and concentrate more power. And if people are fearful, they assent to that. And it's a tough trend. When countries get rich and successful, they start to swing the pendulum back to more top-down control. And to the people that are in power, or you and I think we can work with the system, it isn't going to dramatically hurt our lifestyles, but we slowly stifle opportunity for those low-income people that have yet to rise up. So it's particularly emotional to me. These decisions, COVID is a perfect example. The decisions we make, we can work home from Zoom, right? We can have a statewide thing that says you do this. Well, what about the guy that works in the restaurant downtown? 15% of people are working downtown in Denver. 85% of those buildings are empty right now. So everybody that had a downtown restaurant, a food truck and all that, we've knocked them out of jobs and really wrecked their lives. But they're not considered nearly as much politically as the people that write checks and donations and write editorials and do all that. So policy is always driven for what's best for people in power, for people that are connected. It's always guised in, we're doing it to help these people, but it's always been the opposite. More top-down control of government does not harm so much well-off people. It's very opportunity squashing for low-income people. And expensive energy policies are the same thing.
Well, and you talk about, and it was Mark Mills who sort of like made me think about it a lot this weekend. But Zoom is a great example. The bandwidth that we're consuming is only available because the cost of energy is so low. Therefore, Facebook and Google and others can gather data on every single facet of, wherever I go with my iPhone, it knows where I am. It predicts where I'm going to go. It sends me ads based on it listening to me all the time. And because the cost of energy is so cheap, we gather all this data, which then consumes more energy. And what I found amazing about COVID was, for some reason, restaurants who were the first to adopt paper straws have now moved back to all plastic utensils and plastic plates and plastic cups for safety, and yet they moved from the small plastic straw to a paper straw because they were trying to save the environment. And so as we think about energy demand and plastics and climate change, how do you reconcile the fact that if and I'm not advocating that we are or we aren't, but if humans are changing the climate because of our energy consumption, it seems to me that just reducing consumption is the only solution to climate change, not necessarily from where we get our energy. I'm curious your take on climate change, energy consumption, degrowth, and the whole conversation that occurs around that.
You bet. So I got into the climate change issue maybe a little more than 15 years ago. And the reason was my original company, Pinnacle Technologies, we mapped the motion of fluid underground. So it could be volcanoes are about to become active, could be geothermal flowing water underground to produce steam, or producing oil and gas. And there was a new thing the national labs were looking at, which was taking carbon dioxide, CO2, and injecting it underground, sequestering it underground. So it was a new business line for me. Hey, this could be fantastic. This is going to be huge. And so one of the things I wanted to do was I want to understand what's driving this. All right, how much CO2 can we inject underground? What's climate change? Is this really going to become a big industry? So as a tech nerd, I just dove into the data. What's the chemistry? What's the physics? What's the actual data we have so far? How do these models work? And what I found, of course, was dramatically different than what you heard in the news and the media. Absolutely, humans have increased greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere, coming up on 50% in terms of CO2 concentration. Absolutely, it absorbs infrared radiation, should have a warming effect. If it has no feedback, meaning just if we double CO2 in the atmosphere, which we will by late this century, unfortunately, you and I won't be around, but we'll hit a doubling of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. That would warm the Earth a little more than 1 degree Celsius. Almost uncontroversially a good thing. Far more people die of the cold than die of the warm. You put more plant food in the atmosphere. The Earth is greening. That's one of the most visible impact of climate change so far. Is the Sahara Desert is actually shrinking. The grasslands at the south are growing. Across the planet, the world is greening because there's more plant food in the atmosphere. So there's positive impacts and there's negative impacts. And if there's positive feedback, it gets warmer and therefore more water evaporates, so more water vapor stays in the atmosphere. We could have warming of 2 or 3 or 4 times that. The movement is all based on if there's a lot of positive feedback, the negatives will probably outweigh the positives, and so this is a potential crisis. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the bureaucracy set up to study this, that basically draws on the science from people around the world. Their economic analysis of climate change in this doubling of CO2, so think the year 2070, 2080, their guess or their estimate is that this will reduce per capita income, each person, somewhere between 0.2% and 2%. So that's the IPCC's math for the impact of climate change. That's like 60 years from now, we might have lost a few months or maybe a year of economic growth.
But our shutdown did 35% of GDP in Q2, so that wasn't an issue, but somehow 0.2 to 2% 60 years from the future is crazy.
Yes. So that's the problem of people. And so politicians, they don't read the IPCC reports. In fact, they give me this shocked look when I give them those numbers. That's the IPCC analysis. So, but more likely a negative than a positive, but actually slow moving and quite modest. When you make energy 50% more expensive in California or twice as expensive in Germany, your impact on people's lives is massively larger, immediate, and now. So we're not doing a very good job of evaluating the pluses and the minuses. People say you're a climate change denier if you don't believe it's a crisis. No, I encourage people. We're doing. Sorry to ramble, David.
No, I love this. My mind is blown. So you can. See
we're doing an ESG report at Liberty for the first time, and I want to do an ESG report the way it should be done, which is on the environmental side. When we look at anything, we never look at just the negatives. We always look at balancing negatives and positives. Geez, if I buy a new car, my wife will be happy and the kids will take care of more of their stuff. It's going to take money out of my bank account. It's always about trade-offs. But ESG reports are about how are we reducing our emissions. That does reduce this driving force for climate change. But what's the cost of that? Are you net benefiting humanity by these actions or not? Almost everything we've done in energy policy today, hands down, has been a net negative for human lives, for the environment, for our impacts, because we're only talking about the negatives and not both sides. So we want to write a report saying, what are the positives of what's going on? What are the negatives? And how do these balance? And how can we get the best of both worlds?
So if you cloned yourself and you were in a debate in school back when you could debate a point that you didn't necessarily agree with, but it was good to encourage discussion. What you've described is the greening and a lot of the positives, and I'm trying to think about the negatives. Obviously, a reduction in income, rising sea level, I guess, because most of our cities in the world are on the sea, so we need to like absorb costs for that. I guess I'm missing what the negative of climate change, given that, I mean, intuitively, if you have more parts of, North America and Europe that can be inhabitable for agriculture, presumably you can bring high density food and feed a planet that's going to be 9 billion up from 7.8 today by 2050. What would you be arguing on the flip side for those who are just absolutely petrified of climate change and the negatives? What are the negatives?
So the negatives are that the planet is warming and likely will continue to warm. So it changes like where agriculture should be, right? Here's the sweet spot for growing corn. It's in Iowa. With time that might move north. Well, the farmers are in Iowa. And so, yes, when you change something, there's dislocation. There are costs associated with that. And that's one of the things people say, oh, food production is going to be stressed and it's going to decline. If you look at agricultural productivity, it has been an incredible screaming upward story, which is why we used to have half of Americans worked in food production. Now it's less than 2%. So there are negatives, but you're right. You just got to look at them in balance and what's the trade-off of that. Now, the real arguments, or not the real arguments, the political arguments you hear about climate change are mostly just wrong. One is that storms are worse. We have more hurricanes, more tornadoes, more droughts, the fires in California. These are just uncontroversially not true. We have 110 years of pretty good hurricane data. There's been no increase in the amount of total cyclonic energy or the number of hurricanes or the hurricanes landfalling in the US. Same thing for tornadoes, same thing for droughts. In fact, a slightly warmer world means a slightly wetter world. Drought is actually slowly declining. This could be statistical luck. It could be because of what we know is if the world gets a little bit warmer, it's going to be a little bit wetter, there'll be a little bit more rain. But I'm not saying there's no negative impacts of climate change. There will be, but they're slow moving and they're modest. And that doesn't drive political change. So politicians and media, they never talk honestly about it. They say a bunch of scary things that most of them probably don't even know they're false, but it's not hard to find out that they're false.
I love it. I mean, and again, I think that it's fascinating that we moved from when I was much younger and you were younger 20 years ago from a global a global warming, and now they call it climate change. And what you're saying is indisputably the planet is raising in temperature. So everyone is like, look, the sky is blue. Look, this year's highs are higher than last year's highs. But what you're saying is what we're not talking about is that there are a lot of things like hurricanes. It's like my parents always walk to school both ways uphill carrying their kids on the back. Somehow both ways can't be uphill, but it's always the worst ever, the best ever, the hottest ever. We use hyperbole to describe, but very few people talk about data. Pivoting to your work in charity, because I think, again, a lot of the things you talked about, your move to Liberty Frac was based on blue-collar workers and employing more people than you otherwise could. The climate change and energy policy is really about bringing people out of poverty to have an opportunity to thrive. You're involved, I know, in the ACE charities, which you've been involved with for a while. I'd love for you to talk about it, but also in the context of COVID and in Black Lives Matter without touching it, but the opportunities that are not afforded to people in poverty and maybe the impact that you've seen as a result of COVID and maybe directly that impact on ACE and why ACE is such an important charity to you and overall to opportunity for people.
Fantastic. Yeah, so ACE is Alliance for Choice in Education. We collect private money to give scholarships to low-income kids, which means that they're currently on free and reduced lunch programs in the public schools. So think of the bottom 20% in income in the state of Colorado. Now we're in 9 states. So it's low-income kids that, and then look, I've focused on education a lot of my life because it's one of the things that's still top-down. In the United States, where you're born, the zip code you're in, you go to that school. Sweden, which we often wrongly call socialist, universal school choice. The money goes to the parents, send your kids to the school that's the best fit for them. But in the US, it's just this very un-American institution. So like, what do our parents do? My parents were middle class. When they moved to Denver, they're like, where's the best public schools? We're gonna buy a house. Maybe it's the cheapest house in that neighborhood. So our parents exercise choice. Like, I got a good education. I've had this dreamy life. But if you're an immigrant from Sudan, like some friends of ours, and you just got here and you lived in a low income place, that school that's in your neighborhood may not be a good fit for your kids. In fact, usually isn't. The number one reason people apply for an A scholarship is to escape violence, bullying. You know, they're the kids that didn't fit in, or they're tough bureaucratic schools. So our goal is to give people, I want everyone to be able to pursue their dreams, have the liberty to pursue their dream, whatever that dream is. And education is a huge barrier to that. Low-income people don't get the same skills. They don't get the same optimism we have to pursue those dreams. So in Colorado, we have about 2,500 low-income kids and they weren't picked on scholarship. There was the smart kids. It's not a meritocracy. It's a need thing. They're struggling. They need a place to go. Those 2,500 low-income kids that are on A scholarships, the private schools they go to, all in cost, are about 25% cheaper than our public school system. So private education, people don't realize this, on average is cheaper than public school systems and just crushingly better results. Their reading proficiency, math proficiency, high school graduation, college attendance, all are higher, not just than other low-income kids, they're higher than Coloradans as a whole. Because if you're in a school that if it's a business, if we're not doing a good job with your kids, David, you're going to take them elsewhere.
Yeah.
These schools have to deliver results. These schools are open right now because if they don't educate the kids, they're going to go out of business. Where public schools can say, no, for safety, we're not going to open. We're going to do online education. Well, imagine you've got a caretaker at home that maybe had very poor education themselves, and they got a third grader, and they've got to Zoom into their school. Like, that's not going to advance that child. Our kids, my kids are in college or out of college, but if we could probably help our kids and keep them moving along, not as good, but okay, for low-income people with less educated parents or parents that can't work from home, think of what we're doing to that generation of kids. They were already treated unfairly. We already squelched their opportunity by not allowing them to pick where they go to school. Now we're shutting down their schools and disadvantaging them even more. We're taking an unequal system and making it more unequal. And I think it's deeply unfair and it's deeply unfortunate. COVID, we are hurting, as you talked about, we're hurting the economy. I personally believe, even on a health front, the damages from COVID on public health will be much worse. Our response to COVID, the impacts of that will be much worse than COVID itself. COVID is serious. It's killed a lot of people. It's a great threat for older people. I had COVID myself in March, but it's a serious thing, but our reaction to it is going to cause massively more damage than COVID itself, and particularly for low-income people and people in blue-collar jobs.
I think that that's so important, and for listeners, the passion that Chris has towards education, but when we think about the education system and we think about opportunity and we think about the barriers we put forth, and even just historically, without a college education, we know people would learn less, but you couldn't get into college if you didn't have the right education. And when you have a 6-year-old at home who may or may not have internet because they chose to heat their house instead of have access to everything online, having to have the parents sit with a 6-year-old, get them into Zoom, have them color the penguins, and then upload that picture to the teacher is just not a good system. And so when I think about it, and everything I've read about education, if we want to lower birth rates that help with degrowth, which help with climate change, the more educated women are in third world countries, delays the onset of birthing years. So instead of them having 15 kids starting at 12 to help on the farm, they're educated, they have different opportunities, and they can be 15, 16, 17, and then with wealth comes a lower birth rate, which is why in the first world countries, most people choose to have less than 10 kids because they realize from a wealth standpoint, that is a big burden. Education is where all of this starts. And if we don't focus on education policy in this country, with the COVID crisis, wealthy parents will pull their kids from public schools. They will get worse. They will spend the money to give their kids an even better opportunity, which will widen the poverty gap, which is what we're talking about with energy policy. How did I do there, Chris? Am I as passionate as you?
That's exactly what's happening. That's what's happening. We're taking an unequal opportunity chance thing and making it worse. No, what you said is spot on. That's what's happening right now.
Now, if you could go back, last question before I let you go. I've absolutely loved this hour. The last question is, if you could go back and talk to yourself 25 years ago and give yourself some advice that you now know and wish you knew sooner, that would have helped accelerate a part of your journey or had made you make a different decision in your journey, I'm curious how you would mentor younger Chris.
Wow, I don't know. Look, I've been crazy lucky. And again, it wasn't for thoughtful, great designs. I've been lucky. What I say to young people, what I would mentor to someone is, it's the people you're around, their values and their goals. That's the biggest impact in your life. If you surround yourself with people that want to make the world a better place, that'll always do the right thing even when no one's looking, you're going to have a fantastic life. I don't know what your life's going to be like. It's going to be great. But if you surround yourself with pessimistic people or people that want to win for themselves and don't believe in sort of a fair system or an equality of opportunity, you're going to have a less fulfilling life. So look, the secret of my happiness has been I have been surrounded in my family and in my businesses with great people. Those people have lifted me up. They've been my North Star to understand what's important. So people say, I want to get a job in this particular piece of this particular industry. Well, maybe, because that's interesting to you right now. But you don't know what's going to be interesting to you in 10 years from now. What's timeless is surround yourself professionally and personally with great people that you respect and you look up to. You will have a great life.
I love that advice, and you touched on a point that I'll close with, which is, our industry is going through dramatic change, and through mergers and acquisitions and changing activity and capital and efficiency, unfortunately, one of the only ways our industry can reduce costs is to reduce heads. And what that does is it frees up a whole bunch of oil and gas people to go and find a place that is a growth industry that you'll be able to use your incredible talents. And when you take the core thing about and I look back on my 20-year career, the thing that I loved the most about our industry was that I got data every single day. I absolutely loved the people I worked with. I was creating a product of value that made the world a better place. And it made me very, very good when I got woken up at 2 a.m. with an emergency for being able to resolve what is the crisis, what is the state, what is the safety, what are we going to do, and implement an action plan, which worked out well when I got a call from the police in Paradise Valley at my Airbnb over the weekend. I was very, very calm. And so that skill set is very transitional to other industries. So I encourage those who are underemployed or unemployed, you can bring your talents elsewhere. And like Chris said, luck plays such a huge role, but you need to be in the game long enough to get lucky. And so I encourage everyone to look at that. Chris, any last words? I've just absolutely I love your energy. I've always loved your energy. And I love what you do for the world, for the community, for your employees, and for everything that you touch.
Last thoughts on energy. And David, I agree with you that employment in our industry is going to continue to decline. That is true. So your career advice there is fantastic. But it's declining for a positive reason. It's because of efficiency and success. Almost everyone used to be a farmer and they aren't today. It isn't because farming failed, it's because farming succeeded. Last year in the United States, from the EIA data, oil and gas produced a larger share of US energy than any year ever. We're not only growing in absolute terms, the amount of oil and gas that powers the world, our percent market share in the US actually set a record last year and almost certainly will break it this year. So what we do is important. It matters. You can't build a wind farm or maintain a wind farm or a solar panel without oil and gas. What we do powers the world. It matters a lot. What you do working in this industry matters. Go out there and make the world a better place and make a happier life for yourself. Thank you for your time today, David.
Amazing. Chris Wright, thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day, and bye for now.